The ring arrived on a soft Thursday in May. Beatrice came through the front door holding her hand high so the diamond caught the late light and scattered it across the wallpaper I had chosen the year she was born. I was at the kitchen table shelling peas the way I had shelled peas every spring since she could walk. I set the bowl aside, wiped my hands on the apron she once said was so charmingly old-fashioned, and opened my arms. She let me hold her for exactly 3 seconds. Then she stepped back and the distance began. His name was Julian. Old publishing money, new expectations. His mother wore dove gray silk and spoke of the aesthetic before she ever asked how I took my tea. That evening we sat in the living room where the photographs of Beatrice lined the mantel like quiet witnesses. She spread glossy portfolios across the coffee table, a cliffside villa in Positano, a chateau in Provence, a cathedral in Manhattan with marble floors that cost more to polish for one day than most people earn in a year. I touched one photograph gently. "Will there be room for the picture of you in your first communion dress?" I asked. Beatrice smiled the way you smile at someone who has suggested bringing a paper camera to a royal portrait sitting. "Mother, we've booked Julian Langford. His work is art. We need a clean narrative." I poured tea that went cold. I watched her fingers trace the sample albums and felt the first small erasure begin in every frame of our life. The weeks after were gentle disappearances. My name vanished from the save-the-date cards. Phone calls returned later and later. Dinners cancelled because Julian's mother needs to approve the lighting tests. I told myself it was the whirlwind. Brides become photographs long before they become wives. Mothers learn to step out of the frame. That is the silent bargain we make when we first see their faces. One Sunday in June she came alone. She sat on the edge of the sofa, knees pressed together, the way she used to when she had lost something precious. "Mother," she said, studying her manicure instead of me, "Julian's family feels the wedding should reflect their visual legacy. It might be easier if you let us handle everything." I waited. The clock above the fireplace ticked the same rhythm it had ticked through every difficult conversation we ever had. She finally looked up. "I think the photos will look better if the story is streamlined." I remember tasting salt though I had not cried. I remember smiling the small, harmless smile widow's perfect. "Of course, darling," I said. And the shutter in my heart closed one stop farther. July arrived warm and careless. The roses outside the kitchen window opened the same color they had the year Beatrice took her first steps toward me across the lawn. I watched them from the same chair where I once rocked her through colic and nightmares. The messages began as gentle suggestions. Then they became instructions. "Don't wear patterns, Mother. Julian hates visual noise. Don't stand too close during the family portraits. We're going for minimalism. Don't bring the old silver frame with Dad's photo. It clashes with the palette." Each text landed like a small, precise cut. The bleeding was invisible, but I felt it. In August came the mood board, thick cream pages delivered by courier. I opened it on the kitchen table. Page after page of ethereal brides in ivory and blush, grooms in midnight, mothers in barely their beige or soft dove. My face had been circled in red on one proof and marked remove. I closed the board and laid it beside the cold teacup. I stared until the red circle looked like a wound. One afternoon I drove to the bridal salon unannounced. Beatrice stood on a platform drowning in silk chiffon while Julian's mother adjusted the veil like a curator positioning light. Julian Langford himself was there, camera dangling, already composing shots in the air with his hands. They did not hear the bell at first. I stood in the doorway watching my daughter become a photograph someone else had ordered. When she saw me in the mirror her smile faltered for half a heartbeat. Then it returned, brighter, practiced. "Mother, we're doing test shots. It's very technical. Julian Langford glanced at me once, dismissed me, and went back to his light meter. I said I only wanted to see how beautiful she looked. Beatrice sighed. The planner appeared and gently guided me toward the door. Mrs. Whitmore, perhaps another day. The golden hour is precious. I let her lead me out. The bell sounded thinner leaving than entering. That night I sat in the dark living room surrounded by every photograph we had ever taken together. Beatrice missing front teeth, Beatrice in a graduation gown, Beatrice asleep on my shoulder at midnight, Massachusetts. I touched each frame and felt the years fold themselves into a very small, very cold place behind my ribs. I made tea I did not drink. I looked at the empty spaces on the mantel where new pictures would never include me. And somewhere between the second and third empty space I stopped waiting to be asked back into the frame. August pressed hot against the windows. One evening I went to the attic to find the box of Beatrice's childhood negatives, the ones I had taken with the little Leica her father gave me the year she was 8. Behind the cedar trunk, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with faded ribbon, lay the black leather folio my husband pressed into my hands the week before the cancer took him. I carried it downstairs and laid it on the kitchen table beneath the same lamp we used for report cards and hospital bills. The brass clasps opened with a soft, patient sigh. Inside were bank folders, share certificates, and one thin cream envelope sealed with navy wax. I broke the seal. The contract was dated 3 years earlier, the day Beatrice first brought Julian home for Sunday lunch. My husband had booked Julian Langford for their future wedding should our daughter ever choose a day worthy of forever. Full fee, $425,000, paid in full from an account that carried only my name. Non-refundable after booking. Cancellation by client forfeits everything. At the bottom, in my husband's careful script, if they ever ask you to step out of the picture, tear this up and let the day stay unrecorded. Some moments are not theirs to keep. I read until the words stopped swimming. Then I read again by lamplight while the roses outside the window closed their petals against the dark. I closed the folio, laid my palm on the cool leather, and felt the house settle around me like an old friend who had been waiting for me to remember the combination to the safe. That night I began moving money the way moonlight moves across still water, slowly, silently, leaving no wake. I kept Julian Langford's original contract on the table beneath a single white rose that opened and closed with no one to see. Some nights I walked through the hallway of photographs and touched each frame as though apologizing for what was coming. I left every light burning because darkness felt too much like surrender. I wore the small brass key from the folio on a ribbon beneath my blouse. It rested warm against my heart like a second, steadier pulse. And every morning I laid the contract beside my teacup and watched the light move across Julian Langford's famous signature, the one that had never belonged to Beatrice at all. I was no longer waiting. I was simply preparing the frame for the moment it would remember whose picture it had always been. September came in cool and deliberate. I rose early, made coffee I barely tasted, and opened the heavy cream envelope that held Julian Langford's contract. I laid it beside the mood board Beatrice had left behind and studied both the way a general studies maps before a quiet war. Each week I telephoned Julian Langford's studio from the public library on Wednesdays when Beatrice believed I was at watercolor class. I used the soft, slightly confused voice of a widow who just wants to be sure the deposit is safe. His assistant told me everything: shooting schedule, second shooter names, exact times for the first look, the golden hour portraits, the final midnight sparkler exit. They spoke freely because they believed the mother had already been written out of the story. I wrote every detail in a small dove gray journal, the color of the dress they had suggested I wear. Page by page the journal filled with light angles, lens choices, memory card counts. Quiet ammunition. At night I moved money the way fog moves across the river, slowly, completely, leaving nothing behind. By October the original $425,000 sat untouched in an account Beatrice would never think to check. The rest of the trust grew heavier in places her new family would need years to discover. Beatrice came once in November. She breezed in wearing camel cashmere and new certainty, carrying printed proofs from the engagement session. She spread them across the kitchen table like playing cards. Not one photograph contained me. Even the family shots had been cropped or reposed so only her father's empty chair remained. She looked up and noticed the contract beneath the vase of white roses. Her smile thinned. "Mother, why do you still have that old thing out? It's cluttering the aesthetic." I stirred my tea once, twice. "Just remembering," I said. She laughed the way you laugh at someone who keeps ticket stubs from concerts long over. Then she gathered her proofs and left without noticing the roses had been changed to white, the exact shade of the dress she would wear when no camera waited. That evening I stood before the hallway mirror and practiced the small, pleasant smile that made assistants and accountants tell me their secrets. I practiced saying how thoughtful when I wanted to scream. I practiced breathing in a house that was learning to belong only to me again. December arrived crisp and unforgiving. The invitations came, thick stock, embossed, my name in tiny script at the bottom as an afterthought. I laid mine beside the dove gray journal and the brass key that still hung warm against my heart. Some evenings I sat in the dark living room surrounded by every photograph that still held my face. I left the lights off because shadows felt honest. I was ready. Not bitter. Simply ready the way winter is ready long before the first frost touches the roses. The call came on a Tuesday, exactly 14 days before the wedding. I was at the kitchen table folding the last of the linen napkins Beatrice had once loved to set for Sunday dinner. The phone rang twice before I answered. Beatrice's voice was bright, practiced, kind in the way that is worse than cruelty. "Mother, I need to ask you something difficult." I waited. The clock above the stove ticked the same rhythm it had ticked through every hard conversation we ever had. She took a breath I could hear across the miles. "Julian feels the photographs will be cleaner, more timeless, if the family story is focused. Please stay home. The photos will look better without you in them." Silence pooled between us like spilled milk. I looked out the window at the winter garden sleeping under frost. I looked at the dove gray journal lying open to the page that listed every minute of her perfect day. I said only, "I understand, darling." She exhaled relief so sharp it cut. "Thank you, Mother. I knew you'd be reasonable." She hung up before I could say goodbye. I set the receiver down gently. I finished folding the last napkin into a perfect swan the way I had taught her when she was 7. Then I walked upstairs, opened the wardrobe, and took out the soft dove gray dress she had chosen for me months earlier. I laid it across the bed and looked at it for a long time. Afterward I went to the living room and sat in the wing chair by the window where sunlight used to fall across her hair while she read. I took the brass key from around my neck, opened the small drawer in the side table, and removed Julian Langford's original contract. I held it in both hands and felt the paper warm as living skin. I made one phone call. To a number handwritten on the contract's final page, the private cancellation line my husband had paid extra for. A woman answered on the second ring. I gave the contract number. I said only, "Execute Clause 9, effective immediately." She asked no questions. She simply said, "Confirmed, Mrs. Whitmore. The crew will not appear." I hung up. I walked to the kitchen, made tea I did not drink, and watched the winter light move slowly across the walls. The house was very quiet. It sounded like forgiveness. I did not pack. I did not dress. I stayed home in my robe and slippers and listened to the clock mark every minute that would never be photographed. Outside, The frost glittered like scattered diamonds no one would ever capture. I was not angry. I was simply absent the way winter is absent of color, clean, complete, and impossible to argue with. The cathedral was dressed in white roses and winter light. 250 guests rustled in silk and velvet, programs fluttering like small white flags. Beatrice walked the aisle on Preston's arm, veil floating, smile perfect. She did not look toward the pew where I was not sitting. The string quartet played. The officiant spoke of love and promises. And all the while, the 6 camera stations Julian Langford had marked with discreet brass stands stood empty. No lenses. No assistants. No soft click of shutters that had cost more than most houses. At first it was only a small confusion. A bridesmaid glanced toward the balcony where the main photographer should have been perched. Preston's mother turned, pearls swinging, searching for the familiar silhouette. Beatrice reached the altar and finally noticed. Her smile faltered for the first time all day. The officiant paused after the vows. He looked toward the back of the church where Julian Langford should have been waiting for the recessional cue. Nothing. A low murmur rose like wind through dry grass. Phones appeared. Texts flew. Julian's assistant answered no one. The crew had vanished as completely as breath on a winter morning. Beatrice turned to Preston. Her veil trembled. Where are the photographers? The question carried to the last pew. Preston's mother hurried forward, face tight with panic. She spoke rapidly into her phone, then paled. She looked toward the empty stations, then toward the doors, then at Beatrice with something close to fear. Guests began to understand. 250 people realizing the most documented day of a generation would exist only in phone snapshots and memory. The officiant cleared his throat. Shall we pronounce you husband and wife? Beatrice nodded once, small, stunned. They kissed beneath an arch of roses that would never be professionally lit. The quartet played the recessional. No one threw petals. No one knew where to look. Outside, the winter sun poured cold and clean across the steps. Guests spilled out in expensive coats, phones raised, trying to capture something, anything. Beatrice stood in her cloud of lace, eyes searching the crowd for cameras that were not there. I was not there to see it. I was home, sitting at the kitchen table in my robe, drinking tea that finally tasted of something. The dove-gray dress still lay across the bed upstairs, unworn, unnecessary. They say the reception was beautiful in its way, candlelight, laughter, a string quartet that played longer than planned because there were no timed shots to keep. The phone photographs were lovely, but they were not Julian Langford. The album, when it finally arrived months later, was thin and ordinary. Beatrice came to the house one March afternoon when the frost had just begun to lift. She stood on the porch in boots and the same coat she wore at 16 and asked if I had kept any of the childhood negatives. I made tea. We sat at the kitchen table where every important picture had once been planned. She cried without sound. I passed tissues the way I once passed her crayons. When the cup was empty she whispered, "There are no real photographs of the day." I looked at her for a long, steady moment. Some days, I said, are not meant to be kept in frames that belong to someone else. She left without the coat. I hung it in the closet beside the dove-gray dress that now lives in quiet retirement. Some evenings I walk through the hallway of photographs and pause at the empty space where the wedding portrait should have hung. I do not fill it. Some absences are more honest than any picture could ever be. People ask if I regret it. I tell them regret belongs to those who still believe love can be captured by pressing a button. I have the negatives of every year she was mine. That is enough. The last laugh is never loud. It is the soft click of a shutter that never opens. It is the quiet closing of a front door on a day that tried to write me out of the story. It is an old woman sitting at her own kitchen table, drinking tea that tastes only of peace, knowing every memory worth keeping was already safe long before the cameras arrived. If this story settled gently somewhere inside you tonight, stay a while. The kettle is warm, the light is soft, and there are many more quiet evenings when a woman remembers she was always the picture, never the background they tried to crop. You are safe here. You are seen. And that, my dear, is forever.